As Vice-Chancellor of the University of Sussex, I am proud to introduce the Sussex Conversations, bringing together Sussex academics, alumni and leading thinkers in their field to discuss the challenges that are facing the world today. Let the conversations begin.
Hello, I'm Sarah Montague, and I'd like to welcome you to the Sussex Conversations. Capitalism is dead. Long live capitalism? That is tonight's theme. The theme, the future. We're going to be discussing what the future of capitalism is, indeed, whether it has one. And with all the Sussex themes, it's a broad topic, but we have a very distinguished panel here to help us unpick some of the ideas within that question. I'd like to introduce our panel first of all. Lord Skidelsky is Emeritus Professor of Political Economy at Warwick University. He's written a very well-acclaimed biography, 3-volume biography of John Maynard Keynes. In his time, he's been a member of 3 different political parties: Labour, SDB, Conservative. He's now a crossbencher. On my far right, Nicola Horlock, Chairman of Rockpool Investments. Nicola helped create Mercury Asset Management. She was director of that just at the age of 28. She's been called Superwoman so often for various obvious reasons. She's not only a high-flying city career woman, she's also had 6 children. We're also joined, those are our guests, we're also joined by 2 Sussex people. Professor Mariana Mazzucato is R.M. Phillips Professor of Science and Technology Policy at Sussex. Her publication, The Entrepreneurial State, has had a significant policy impact in the UK and in Europe. And finally, last but not least, Professor Alan Winters, who's Professor of Economics at Sussex. He's Director of Research. In his career, he's had many roles, not least among them Director of Research at the World Bank and Chief Economist at the Department for International Development. Just before we sort of launch into the debate, just a couple of sort of housekeeping things. We are streaming this live on the internet, as you'll know. We're going to be taking questions from the audience. Now, look, the obvious thing goes to, you might want to bang on about something. Please don't. Please keep any contributions short. When you do, if you say your name and where you come from, it can be Fred from Sussex, but it can be just a little bit longer if you think it's relevant. But so, and then, as I say, a short question, if possible, or contribution to debate. If you want to follow it online as well, the Twitter hashtag is Sussex Convo, so there will be a debate going online, and I'll be trying to keep an eye on it on the questions that come in on my iPad here. We've got at least an hour ahead of us. We're going to break it into different chapters, and in each of those chapters, one of our guests will speak to that particular idea. Can I ask you, first of all, to welcome our guests? Now, since the collapse of communism, there has been no obvious coherent alternative to capitalism. Capitalism itself, though, is now being questioned, and not just because of the financial crisis, but also because capitalism, at least in the way that it has worked in the West, doesn't appear to have worked for everyone, and even those it has worked for, the wealthiest of the wealthy in the West, they seem increasingly to be questioning whether actually they're happier as a result. So, let us start with a framing of this debate, if we may, by Lord Skidelsky. Is there life after capitalism?
There is life after capitalism, a very long life, actually, because capitalism will have done its job, which is to create wealth, and it can't go on creating wealth forever and ever and ever and ever. We've got a long time left on this planet, so we've got to actually think of life after capitalism. And do you want? Should I talk a bit about that?
Please do.
Yeah, because capitalism. I don't come to bury capitalism prematurely. Capitalism is the greatest wealth-creating machine the world has ever known. But I want to start with a figure that is going up there if you look at that, this plots rising per capita income in Britain against self-reported life satisfaction levels. What it shows is that more income doesn't buy you more happiness. Indeed, above a certain rather low income level, there's no relation at all between income and happiness. The obvious question is, why do we make growth of gross domestic product the main object of policy? We're always being told, aren't we, that we must become more and more competitive to prevent us falling behind, further and further behind in the global race for greater riches. Some economists, though, have concluded that this is a delusion, that it's irrational to go on trying to maximize economic growth if it doesn't make us happier. So rather than that, they say we should make happiness our goal. After all, the aim of life is to be happy, isn't it? We should target gross national happiness rather than gross national product. It's quite serious. There's now a flourishing branch of economics called happiness studies. And I understand that English state schools are now required to provide happiness training. Happiness economists like Richard Layard have tried to justify making happiness the supreme end by reference to Aristotle's idea of eudaimonia. But for Aristotle, eudaimonia was justified happiness, not just psychological happiness. Eudaimonia is not the same as euphoria. Happiness is good if there are things to be happy about, but it's bad to be happy if the right response to a situation is unhappiness. It would be wrong to be happy in face of death of a loved one, obviously. But such a state could be induced by alcohol or drugs. And this shows the slippery slope down which relentless utilitarianism leads one. Bentham thought that quantity of happiness was all that mattered, quality was irrelevant. A utilitarian can have nothing to say against a government which distributes free a psychic drug which keeps its population in a state of idiotic bliss. So while we, my son and I, wrote this book, How Much Is Enough, while we agree that the happiness economists have identified a key problem with our present civilization, we can't agree with their remedy. And we follow Aristotle and all non-utilitarian philosophers in holding that the end or purpose of human existence should be to attain the good life. And we identify 7 basic goods which constitute the good life. These goods are not plucked out of the air. They're culled from the philosophic reflection of all times and at all places. And they are as follows. I'm not allowed to show them, so I'll have to actually say what they are. Health, security, there's 7. Health, security, respect, personality, harmony with nature, friendship, and leisure. Our assumption is that the so-called developed economies have already accumulated enough wealth, capitalism has already made that possible, for most people to be able to lead a good life. The fact that their populations go on working almost as hard as they did when societies were much poorer than ours suggests that something is very wrong with our social and economic arrangements. And the state has a large part to play in altering those arrangements, so as to make it easier for people to lead a good life. And we're talking of a democratic state, not a state that coerces its population. Now, the changes we propose are these: limitations on hours of work and work sharing, basic citizens' income, progressive consumption tax, and curbs on advertising. I'll just say one word about each, as I'm only allowed one word. All these policies already exist in a very weak form, but they're very, very weak compared with the forces driving people towards the bad life in our society. Consider first hours of work. Intolerable interference with the liberty of contract. Nonsense. France has legislated a 35-hour working week. There's a 40-hour working week European work directive. We already have limits on daily or weekly hours in some occupations, mostly in transport, where wakefulness seems to be an essential requirement. A government could gradually reduce the maximum hours of paid work allowed in many occupations so as to increase leisure. A practical way of giving effect to a shorter working week is work sharing. If a machine can cut necessary human labour by half, why make half the workforce redundant than employing the whole workforce for half the time? Security is one of our basic goods. I would restore the full employment guarantee abandoned by Margaret Thatcher. All people who want to work should be guaranteed a certain number of hours worked per week. If the gains from automation were not being mainly seized by the rich, the reduction in hours would be possible without any loss of income on average. Then we would increase, second, the choice between work and leisure by means of an unconditional citizen's income. Unconditional, not connected with the workplace. Our critics retort that this would weaken the incentive to work. Exactly. The minority who inherited wealth in the past always had this choice. We would extend it to the majority in the form of a national dividend payable from the inherited capital of a rich society. Why should that choice only always be the prerogative of a minority? To make such payments, my third point, would require big changes in the tax system. We propose a progressive consumption tax. Above a certain threshold, all spending would be subject to an escalating scale of tax. The larger the person's consumption, the more tax that person would pay, and the heaviest taxes would fall on the luxury spending of the rich. It would have three advantages. It would reduce competition in consumption, which is one of the things that drives our machine forward. It would increase saving for retirement, and it would be a source of income for finance for the basic income. Finally, we would attack the relentless pressure to consumer spending by placing curbs on television and eventually internet advertising. You know, economists always claim that the only effect of advertising is to make it easier for people to get what they want. Advertising is an information device. This shows that most economists are people who sacrifice reality to the beauty of their models. Advertising's main job is not to convey information, but to create wants. Advertisers create the need for an object by attaching to it the illusions of the happiness that it'll bring. We know it's an illusion because we know from figure 1 that more and more doesn't increase the total of satisfaction, rather the reverse. As the former director of General Research Lab accurately put it, advertising is the creation of organized dissatisfaction. I mean, that is its purpose. Curbs can be done in a non-coercive way, the way you arrange programming, the financing of television, and so on. So, I've ended. I believe we have identified a key question for our time: what lies beyond capitalism? And we can't postpone discussing that forever. Thank you.
Can I ask you, Lord Skidelsky, do you see any political party taking up your ideas?
Yeah, sure. Maybe I'd have to start it myself, and then have a fourth party in my career and my CV.
It's interesting listening to that, though. You're limiting the hours people work, an unconditional income to weaken the incentive to work. Yeah. This idea of taxing anything that somebody wants to for spending.
Escalating.
It's sort of, is it a reversion to socialism?
No, it's nothing to do with socialism, because it repudiates classic socialism, which is state ownership. We reject state ownership on grounds of personality and also respect. No, it's not that. And it's not a party political program for now, at this moment in time. You know, Ed Miliband is not going to be advocating this at the next election. And our spirit is very much in the spirit of Keynes, who wrote Economic Possibilities for Our Grandchildren in the middle of a depression in 1930. And he said, let our imagination take wing and sort of start thinking about the life we may be able to lead in 100 years' time. And I mean, I'm sort of doing a repeat of that in a way.
Okay. Well, before I come out to the audience for just some response to these ideas, Professor Winters, what do you think about, I mean, the good life? I presume you like the idea. Would you like to live in Lord Skidelsky's good life?
I think I would like to live in his good life. I guess.
Do you think you'll get to that by following the second half of the solutions?
The solutions? Well, no, I don't think you will, because I do think it would undermine the incentives that everybody else had to produce as much stuff as everybody else wants to consume, leaving a bit over for me. So I think that to limit hours and say that you wouldn't have any reduction in average income just wouldn't be right. I think average incomes would come down. I have to say I can't imagine how one could have a progressive consumption tax unless it was a progressive income tax. Because the idea that every orange that I buy, the shopkeeper is going to have to inquire, and how much have you spent this year already in order to calculate the tax rate, just doesn't make sense. So it does seem to me there are serious sort of administrative issues about it, but most important, the idea that says you may not spend another hour working because I think it will be bad for you, is almost like state socialism.
But I don't propose that that ban applies over all occupations. There are many occupations in which there are some occupations in which we already
Are you happy to have the hours you work
apply.
limited?
Indeed not, and indeed, and indeed, I'm not a paid employee doing a soul-destroying job.
But that's, in a sense, there are an awful lot of people who aren't in that situation, perhaps working for themselves.
No, absolutely. We're suggesting a principle that can be applied to a range of occupations. A lot of people work longer than they want to. I mean, trade unions and workers' organizations throughout their history have asked for shorter hours. That has been a consistent demand. They don't like working the hours they do, but they're made to.
Nicola Horlick, what are your thoughts on what we've heard?
Well, I just wanted to know about property. Who would own the residential property? Would you have a mortgage, or would the state own the property?
No, state doesn't own the property. Why would the state own the property?
Well, because that's been one of the problems over the last few years. I mean, people see it as a strength that we've had rising housing costs, prices, but that actually imposes a great burden, especially on younger people coming into the housing market, even with interest rates at a very low level. And so one of the reasons that people have to work so hard is to actually cover those costs. And if you live in the southeast and you have to travel into work, and if you're a working woman and you have childcare costs as well, when you add together the cost of housing, the cost of travel and the cost of childcare, then that's the reason why people are having to work such long hours and so hard. So unless you had some major subsidy on housing, I don't see how you could work shorter hours and be happy.
Well, the basic premise is that we are, in our kind of societies, we are rich societies, by historical standards immensely rich. The fact that there are lots of people who are still poor, who don't have the material requisites, is a matter of distribution. And we have to actually look at the problem of distribution. Hence the word progressive tax comes into my talk.
Let's get some. Anybody got any thoughts or questions on what we've heard from Lord Skidelsky on this? Now, if we're going to get to microphones, we've got some microphones. Can we get one to the gentleman here in the blue jumper? Could I have your question, please?
I've got a small problem with it. It's very utopianist, and surely the biggest problem is that the rich people who own everything and make all their money out of getting everyone else to work for them are not about to give it all up, and they're not about to allow us to have this lovely life you're talking about. The only way that's going to happen is if we take everything over. We've actually got to bring ourselves back to the real questions in the world about how do we manage to establish power, and how do we manage to build a world where you can have that kind of nice life, and where you can do what Marx said, which is all you're talking about, which is that you can develop a world where people live to work rather than work to live, which is what Marxism said. And that's what we need to talk about. And that brings you to questions like revolution and overturning capitalism.
Actually, just on that, there's a gentleman at the back. If we can get the microphone to him. You're going to set up your next party with this manifesto. I mean,
I'll have to try for longevity, I think, in that case, which would be contrary to my idea. I'd have to be kept alive by spare parts of one kind or another in order to get.
Can you see any of our current generation of politicians taking this problem on and coming up with any, I don't know, solutions that might move us in the right direction?
Look, politicians have ears, but not eyes. And if they hear, that people are actually thinking about these things, that a lot of people voluntarily are opting out of the rat race in one way or another. There are lots of small movements of dissent going on all over the world, and most recently manifested after the collapse of 2008-9. People just started asking these sort of questions. Well, okay, someone can do something about that.
Let's take one more question before we move on.
Yes, Fabrice from London. I was just asking about your dividend for all. I was just wondering if that's the equivalent of giving everybody an unemployment payment, every adult, whether they're working or not, and then presumably that if you did that, then that would enable you to get rid of the DSS and save loads of money like that?
No, well, it's conceptually quite different, because an unconditional citizen's dividend is not linked in any way to the labour market.
No, precisely. So
But
all adults
unemployment
get a
benefit
payment.
is.
So that's what he
Unemployment,
said. Does it replace the unemployment benefit? Do you just give everybody this dividend?
Everybody gets £200
Well,
a week,
yeah.
and you get rid of all
well,
the
but
bureaucracy.
all people do, yes, absolutely. I mean, if you then have a full employment guarantee of the type I'm talking about, then I mean the benefit element in our present system will shrink.
And you don't mind that people might choose not to work as a result?
No. I never minded that the rich chose not to work over. I want to extend that privilege to more people.
Let's move on to our next chapter this evening, because many would say that we're in the state we're in because of bankers. They've been greedy, they've been feckless, they've been reckless. Let's hear from one. I couldn't resist it, Nicola. Nicola Horlick, you're a city super banker. You are here, obviously, to give a defence of banking and our need for it.
Well,
please take the floor.
Just correct you, because I'm not a banker, and nor have I ever been. But I have worked for fund management businesses that have been owned by banks, but technically not a banker. So what I was doing was something much more helpful, which was managing people's pensions and unit trusts and so on and so forth. And I still manage money today. So from that point of view, I've been an investor in banks rather than somebody who was working for a bank. Because in most investment portfolios which are invested in the stock market, the banking sector, even after everything that's happened, is an important part of the stock market and has been relied on in the past for quite a lot of dividend growth and yield for investors. So I think my big question is, why did all of this happen? Is it the end of capitalism because it did? Well, clearly it isn't the end of capitalism, but what can we do about it, and how long is it going to take us to get out of the mess that has been created? And as far as investors go, the professional investors, I think they have a lot to answer for, because why weren't they questioning the very, very high bonuses that some of these bankers were getting and some of the crazy things that they were doing? And it's really very hard for me to work out why they didn't question it. If you think about it, if you have an insurance policy or if you have an investment in a UK unit trust, you are likely to be the owner of a bank. And behind that, there is a professional investor who is looking after that investment for you. So you may not even realise that you have shares in Barclays Bank, but you actually do. And it is up to those professional investors to safeguard those investments for you and to question what those companies are doing. And somehow, the investment managers got caught up in the hype. I came into the city, actually a very long time ago now, 30 years ago this year, and in those days, banks were regarded as pretty low-grade organisations. They were valued relatively lowly by the stock market. As most of you will probably know, most shares are valued on a multiple of their earnings. So if somebody makes, £10 million and they're on 10 times earnings, then the market capitalisation is 100 million. And the banks were actually rated way down. They were on 4 or 5 times earnings when the market was on 10 or 11 times earnings. And the general feeling amongst investors in the early 80s was that they were low-grade organisations that made poor decisions generally and contributed heavily to the economic cycles by bad decision-making. They would get caught up in the excitement of a boom, throw money at people to borrow, and usually property developers and so on, and then the whole thing would collapse again. And then somehow we convinced ourselves that Gordon Brown was right, and the economy was going to grow forever. And it was we were in some sort of economic utopia where everything was wonderful. And the banks suddenly became terribly exciting things to invest in, partly because of some very good managers who came along. So, for example, at Lloyds Bank, there was Brian Pittman and Jeremy Morse who turned around that bank and made it look so much more profitable and attractive as an investment. And so what happened was that people began to believe that there was a new paradigm. And I can tell you, having been an investor for 30 years, when people start talking about new paradigms, that is normally the time to sell a stock because there are never any new paradigms. And usually, they're just trying to justify some excess that's in the system. So, when When Japan was, the market was bigger in 1989 than the US market, we had a new paradigm, and that was the time to sell. So, you know, the fact of the matter is the banks have not really changed. They did the same thing as they've always done, which was to get carried away in the last boom and throw too much money at the wrong people and ended up with balance sheets which were shot to pieces. But we did have a new element, which was the fact that there were all these people taking enormous amounts of money out of those businesses, and to the detriment of the shareholders, who not only didn't have that money anymore because it had been paid, you know, there were $50 million bonuses being paid out, but also then had to take the hit, huge hit, and then we as taxpayers had to take an additional hit in bailing everything out. So it has been a very, very sorry story, and I don't think anybody can actually really defend all of that. How can anyone defend it? And I actually, to a large extent, blame all the fund managers in the city who really should have been a bit more on the ball and questioning what was happening. So we are where we are. I don't believe that capitalism is dead. I actually think that in the UK, we have a pretty good take on capitalism. It's been a country that has bought into capitalism forever. We have never been under communist rule, thankfully. Communism clearly did not work, as was demonstrated by the demise of the Soviet Union and all that came with that. And it resulted in oppression, in corruption, and all the things that became hateful about those regimes, suppression of individuals and terrible human rights records. So, you know, that clearly doesn't work. So what we're left with is a view of capitalism which is more in line with what we have here, what is in America, but I actually prefer what we have. And the idea that we should work hard, earn money, pay taxes, and that the basic things like health and education should be paid for, and that those who are unable to contribute for whatever reason are supported and are helped to survive, that in my view is the only way to run a society. Now, there are many, many other questions, and I was actually told I could only talk for 4 to 5 minutes, never mind 7 or 10. So it's very, very difficult to cover all of this in such a short space of time. But I would say, as I just said, that we actually have a system that does work incredibly well. I think we have to put aside what has happened with the financial sector for the time being. It will take a long time to recover. We are not going to see dramatic economic growth to bail us out in the short term. We are left with a big debt burden, which somehow we have to pay off over time. Individuals are already scaling back on their individual, on their own consumer debt, but the government, the state, is left with a big burden. And all of that has to be addressed over many years. Trend growth in the UK is meant to be 2.5% or whatever. I don't see that returning in a hurry. So it's going to be a difficult period of time for all of us. We're already feeling it. But the main thing is that we do have a health system that works. We do have an education system that works. We do have real democracy. We do have a say. And there are people who sweep our streets and make sure that the lights are on and that everything works in this country. And so to that extent, having a period of austerity, having a period where there isn't dramatic growth isn't necessarily a bad thing, and maybe is good for us and is good for the soul, ultimately.
How long? Nicola Hall. The way you talk, it's going to just be a reversion pretty much to life as it was before. How long do you reckon before we're out of the mess?
What was life before? We've had various cycles and at various stages,
But how long before we're clear of the economic, there is a recovery and we are clear of a recession?
Well, I think it's going to take a very long time. I think we're
Which
kidding
means
ourselves.
How long?
Well, it could be decades. Look at Japan. It's not an easy thing to correct.
Can I
what
ask
we
you,
decided to do is print money and allow some inflation back into the system. That is the British way of doing things. That's what we do. I'm not an economist. I'm just a practitioner in the money markets and so on.
But you were in a fund manager, and you blame the fund managers, and you say you don't know why people didn't question the bonus culture. Did it feel wrong?
It felt very wrong to me. I think we've imported some of this from the States.
But you were sitting in there in a finance house doing very well.
Yes, but I wasn't managing those sorts of portfolios at that time. So in 2007-8, I was not managing quoted equities. So I wasn't, when I was running big fund management businesses.
What we always everybody you speak to in the city wasn't doing that job.
I truly wasn't. I stopped doing that in 2003. So
but I guess in a way, the point really was leading more towards that question, I suppose, of inequality, which is that anybody in the city is doing an awful lot better than those who are struggling to get the job as the street cleaner. And that inequality, I wonder if that has felt uncomfortable to you over the years.
No, it does feel uncomfortable to me, and I think the biggest extremes are in the investment banks. Investment managers are not paid anything on the scale.
But you still do pretty well.
Yeah, they do, obviously relative to the national average wage, yes. But yes, I think that there was excess in the city. And yeah, I think you've got to remember, though.
Is there excess now?
Well, going back to what happened when Thatcher came into power, and of course there's been a huge amount of debate about that in recent days because of her death. But the country was in a dire state, and it was a disaster. And goodness knows what would have happened if somebody hadn't got a grip of it. You can argue about whether she went about it in the right way. It had a major effect on the manufacturing industry. But what came out of it was the city, ultimately. But what was lost during the early 80s was we got back by having a very, very successful financial services business, which partly happened by mistake because of the time zones and the language, but partly happened because we have lots of intelligent, interesting people here who were able to make
so you credit it with pulling us out. Do you also blame it for pushing us back in?
Yes, I mean...
And is there excess now? You didn't answer that question a moment ago. Is there excess now in the city?
Far less so than there was.
But there still is?
There's still some excess.
Okay.
I still feel that the people at the top of these businesses are paid ridiculous amounts of money which are unjustifiable.
Okay. Some thoughts from the other panellists. Who wants to come back?
I'm appalled at the doctrines Nicola put forward in a very charming and plausible way. You see, I think you've got the wrong economic theory. I don't think we have to suffer depression for decades. I think that's rubbish. I mean, this is a matter of policy. It's not a question. It's not that we have to pay back our debt. I mean, governments don't have to pay back their debt. No governments pay back their debt. They never have. So that is all wrong. What we have to do is grow the economy. But above all, I'm very shocked at the morality of consigning millions of people to pay the price of the greed and follies of a few. I mean, I think that's just wicked. And it's not enough to say, well, we'll look after them and the health service will work all right and it'll carry them off in an emergency. That's not a sufficient response to a generation of lives that are going to be wasted.
And you're just blaming the city for that?
No, it's not entirely the city's fault. Of course it isn't. But it is still the fact that it was the excesses of the banks that got us into this trouble. And you can't then just sit back and say, well, we've got to grin and bear it for 20 years. I mean, who is going to grin and bear it?
No, I just think... I think that is just the reality of the situation. I don't think it's easy to get out of the mess that we're in. And you could spend more money. We could have more infrastructure spend. We can build more hospitals, build more schools, try and get more money into the economy so that we can have growth. But fundamentally, we have a massive burden of debt.
Who has?
The UK, and it's going to take a long time. Now, I'm not suggesting we pay back all of it. We don't need to pay back all of it. You should always have some debt, and there is a market for guilt, so that's fine. But the fact is that we have excess debt, which we have to get rid of, and that's going to take some time.
We have excess debt because the economy has collapsed. That's why we've got excess debt. It's not easy. It's not easy, I agree, but we've got to try. I mean, it seems to me that yours is almost a counsel of despair.
Professor Winters.
Well, I'd like to tease Robert a bit. I mean, so the good life involves growing for a decade to sort of pay off the debt or not pay off the debt. I mean, I think one's got to be clear that if growth is the answer, in the sense we have to be very serious about growth. What Nicola says, it seems to me, is entirely correct. We are in a mess. It's not just the government that's got debt. The banks, the banking system is in a dreadful mess. We need to sort it out. The smartest and quickest way of sorting it out, very unpleasant though, is default. Just sweep away. Just say, look, we never pay it back. You should have known better. I'm not advocating that. But if we're not going to go that way, we have to chip away at it, lump by lump.
Hence it takes decades.
Hence it takes decades.
It's not clear. You're right, I think, to tease Lord Skidelsky, forgive me, but not least because it's not clear, it's not clear to me, is growth the answer?
In the short run, when you're in a hole, you don't say, well, this is the new normal. Now we all start leading the good life. Of course you don't. I mean,
but you had said capitalism has done its job, and then you're saying but you don't like the idea that it's dead, and yet everything else that you seem to suggest it is
there's
dead.
a cycle and there's a trend. Obviously, I mean, Keynes wrote Economic Possibilities for Our Grandchildren in the middle of the Great Depression. He was a depression economist. He wanted a recovery. But he said, recover to what you can achieve, then you start thinking about what you do afterwards. If you're in our situation now, you've got to recover. Of course you've got to try and recover, and it's going to be very hard. Of course it's going to be hard, but we've got to try. You can't just sit back and say, look, we mustn't do anything for 20 years.
Yeah,
I thought that's what you said.
We need growth. We need the economy to grow. That would increase tax take, and of course that helps to pay down the debt. The problem is, how do we grow? And I think the fixes are terribly long term. They're to do with the education system. It's to do with having more computer scientists, more people to do biological sciences, more people to do engineering. And we have not got the right mix of skills at the moment to go out there and compete globally. And we also did allow our manufacturing sector to collapse. And you look at Germany and look at the strength of Germany, it's those mid-tier companies, all those engineering companies, which are actually family-owned, not floated on the stock market when they were relatively small in order to cash in early, which is what happened here. And we have a big hole and an imbalance in our economy, too much reliance on finance, not enough manufacturing. You can't cure that in a couple of years.
Now, look, let's get some people from the audience brought in here. Let's get the microphones out. Can we go to the lady there in the striped shirt and then the gentleman in the blue shirt after that? Can we have your, again, name and short contribution?
Emily Shirley from Kent. My question is really, how does the environment fit into all this? The idea of growth is we've got this indefinite set of resources. I know the GDP encompasses, resources, not just the, how do we deal with the fact that our environmental restraints and what we need to deal with, like climate change, dwindling biodiversity, air pollution, water pollution, etc. How are we going to address that in the new sort of economy? Where does growth fit into that? Because we only have, the environment is limited, finite.
Quick thought on this, Professor.
Well, just on the kind of investments that need to be made on sort of the climate change problem, it's very interesting that people talk about, that there's not enough finance. Really, we don't have the right type of finance. So we don't have long-term, committed, patient finance, which you actually need to develop things like wind, solar, and biofuels. Venture capitalists want their returns in 3 years. They are, again, extracting value that is created elsewhere. Where are we going to, how are we actually going to set up an ecosystem of finance that is willing to invest in the long term, 10 to 15 years? And if you look around the world, it's the Chinese Development Bank, the Brazilian Investment Bank, it's ARPA-E, which is part of the US government, that are really making the big capital intensive and investments in green in areas that still have very high technological and market uncertainty. So we really have to get away from this notion of the state as just sort of nudging the private sector and actually leading the way, which is what has always happened in every technological revolution.
I'm conscious we've got a lot of ground to cover. I promised this gentleman a question in the blue shirt. Could you get the microphone to the gentleman in the blue shirt?
Ian Jocelyn from Surrey. The question I've got really is, this has all been a very top-down prognosis, diagnosis. Capitalism's greatest strength, from Adam Smith, The Invisible Hand, Hayek, it's all about distributed individuals getting together in markets, coming up with their own solutions to their own problems. And I think that the real problem is that society and technology have meant that people are doing increasingly narrow jobs. The products that they're being asked to buy are becoming increasingly specialized. The producers are getting increasingly inside people's skulls. They know their secret desires and their fears. And there's no counterweight, there's no morality there. And as a consequence, we've got producer capture in industry after industry, which is why the guys that can capture these niches, get the mass demand, the Facebooks, whatever it is, that's why they're doing so well. My view is that the only solution, whatever system you come up with, will be bottom up. And I know it's been talked about, we've got grassroots movements, but Look at the average man on the street. They're not interested in this conversation. This will be way over their heads. Self-actualization is great. This room all loves self-actualization. It's a completely foreign concept to the man on the street. Until they get it, until they see that graph and they say, I'm going to get rid of that top line, I'm going for the bottom line, it's not going to work. We're going to be stuck in this rut. You have to get over that view. Otherwise, you've lost.
It might be an idea that we'll come back to, but let's move on at the moment, because there are other forms of capitalism, of course. We haven't even talked really about the rest of the world. Is it just Western capitalism that's in chaos, or are there alternatives that are working? Professor Winters has said, don't worry about capitalism, it's safe in the hands of the Chinese.
I have.
Professor Winters,
yeah, so let me
take
give
the
you
floor.
the backstory to that, really. That's where we'll end up. I want to talk about the developing world. That's the other 6 billion people in the world. Okay? Their problem is not that they've got too much. Satiation is not the problem. Frankly, the environment is not the problem. If you talk to anyone in a developing country, the problem is straight up and down income, not enough of it. If there are still 1.6 billion people in the world, 1.6 billion who live on less than $1.25 a day at our prices. I don't know how many of you have seen that sort of poverty. That is very poor. Even in India, average incomes in India, $800 a year. These people are the people who have got, as it were, the real problems. We may have taken a hit of 10% in the last 5 years. That's taken us down to $34,000 a head, roughly speaking. So the question that the developing world asks is, what generates the income? Lord Skidelsky has already told us it's capitalism. And we can have a sort of a Bill Clinton-esque sort of debate about depends exactly what you mean by capitalism, but let me define it as being essentially using markets to do a large part of the allocation of resources and the decision taking. Exactly like the gentleman up there said, actually going back so that individuals are not told what they want to consume or where they've got to work or how long they can work, but they can work that sort of thing out for themselves. A structure whereby there are some incentive to do it because you can be fairly sure you'll get most of the rewards of the things that you create. A structure that's moderately stable so that you can look safely 5 years ahead and say, yes, it's worth building an extension, it's worth investing in this or that. It's essentially, capitalism has proved to be the way that you harness people's interests in improving their lives. In the West, it might be that we improve the quality. In the South, in the developing country, you improve the quantity of income. The history of the developing world is pretty sordid. Over the 60s, 70s, 80s, growth, the increase in incomes was very low, particularly the 70s, 80s, lost decades. Since about the mid-1990s, there's been very strong amounts of reform in the developing world. Growth rates have picked up very considerably. We all know about China. It's grown about 10% per annum for 30 years. But since 1995, Africa has been increasing incomes per head. They've been increasing in Latin America. And that is essentially because they've created an environment where indeed people find it worthwhile to invest, to get educated, and to produce. Governments have a role. I don't want to talk about whether we want 2% more government spending or 2% less government spending. Governments are an important part of the story, but the real motive force comes from unleashing the aspirations, essentially. I hate that word since it's become politically correct, but essentially the incentives that people have to improve their own lives. Now, what about the crisis? The crisis happened in the West, and in 2008, the Western economy, the wheels fell off, basically, and that was moderately bad news for the developing world. In 2009, most of the developing world took a significant hit on its growth rates. 2010, up to now, they've picked up again. China has continued to increase incomes per head, 7% per annum. East Asia at 6% per annum. Even sub-Saharan Africa, so dependent on the European market, has increased incomes per head at 1.5% per annum over the crisis period where we've not managed to grow at all. These economies are very, very much more buoyant now, and essentially they're more buoyant because they've set up a system that is willing and able to encourage production. Now, of course, there are huge issues. If you're that poor, there are lots and lots of issues. The environment we've talked about, And I think it is very important, and the global environment is going to be very important, and I hope that the West will sort of recognize its role in the global externalities like carbon dioxide creation. But there's also huge problems about inequality in the developing world. As countries grow fast, some people manage to take more opportunity than others. But these are issues that we do have some ideas about how to address, and they have to do with allowing people to work moderately freely, providing them education, providing them health, and they also probably require welfare systems of some sort. They can't be very generous because we can't afford it, and also because people need to have essentially an incentive to get out of bed. But yes, there is room for governments to manage quite a lot of that. Food is another issue that we're going to face in the next 10, 20 years. And who grows the food? Farmers. The farmers, collective socialist farms? No, they're completely discredited. All that food is going to be grown by the private sector. That's the sort of thing that we need, essentially, to have a system that generates incentives, not only for the mega farmers in the US, but for the smaller farmers in the developing world. So the essential point that I want to make is, yeah, capitalism is actually much healthier now globally. The world is much healthier globally. We've cut poverty very substantially. The developing world is continuing to grow. And it's growing basically with the engine of capitalism. Think about a car. It needs an engine. Capitalism is that engine. It needs a steering wheel, the government, it needs some brakes, central bank, but basically it's not a car, it's not going to go anywhere, it's not going to make these people's lives easier unless we have that engine.
And when we talk about tinkering with capitalism, reforming, changing it, upheavaling it, in the West, do you fear about what effect that could have on developing countries?
It certainly still is the case that if the West makes a real hash out of its economic life, that will impinge on the developing countries. The rich countries still account for 2/3 of the world economy. So when the West sneezes, yes, the developing countries catch a cold. But increasingly, they are becoming more independent.
And state-sponsored capitalism in China, can that survive in its...
Oh, no, I'm sure that China will evolve, but think about
Will it
China.
move to more private? I'm just wondering.
Well, you have to work out, well, so let me just make the statement about how private it is. All of Chinese agriculture is private. 80% of China's industrial output now comes from the private sector. So the state is heavily involved, but I haven't checked the numbers, but I wouldn't be at all surprised to hear that France has got a greater share of industrial output from the public sector. But the basic point is, sure, the Chinese haven't worked it all out. It's certainly not perfect. It's rather nasty in lots of respects, and they clearly will, I think, let it evolve. But China has fairly much become a capitalist economy.
Okay, some thoughts on this. Lord Skidelsky, do you want to start?
I mean, Sarah, you're quite right. I mean, there are different models of capitalism. I know Nicola talked about the British model, and I think you suggested the British model and what's sometimes called the Anglo-American model is the best version, but there is the Scandinavian model. Scandinavia, very, very successful societies. There's the Dutch model. The Dutch work far fewer hours than we do, and yet their per capita income is just as high, if not higher. And there's the German social market economy. So there are different versions of this. It's not a question, it's not a choice we have to make between Ronald Reagan and Stalin. There's a huge amount of intermediate territory that's very well worth exploring. And the second point, last point I want to make, is that, of course, I mean, very, very poor people, for very, very poor people, more income is crucially important. And you can't begin to say they've got enough. Though it's important to make the point that there's not very much correlation between happiness and income above a very certain,
it's above 20,000, I seem to recall from that study.
You've got to go upwards. So that's absolutely fine.
But I'm always so curious about
the best way of doing it?
And it slightly speaks to the question that the gentleman raised about 20,000. Would you be happy on 20,000?
Dollars we're talking about, or pounds, or euros.
Dollars. Yeah.
Well, no,
Okay.
not with all the temptations to buy stuff that's around the place.
But
you
if
know,
they
I
were
might
to
feel
put the
myself
curb-
deprived. Yeah, but
I mean,
I
listen,
mean,
the reason I ask the question is this question it's down to individuals, and individuals.
I've worked with ordinary people. I work in the real world. I don't work in academia, and I'm afraid
these are cliches. These are cliches. The real world.
All right, but the point is,
what's the real world?
People. I've worked with many people because I work as a consultant in different places, and they buy into the dream of material. They buy into the dream of material wealth is happiness. Now, I happen to agree with you. But I'm not the guy that is going to give you the votes to get you into power. You have to collectively win the argument, hearts and minds. You can't just go and impose various things and say you're going to work less
but here's
time.
my problem.
It's just a pipe dream.
Everybody may agree with you in theory or agree with this idea. Isn't it interesting? More than 20,000 doesn't make you happy. I can kind of buy that. But then if you then followed it with, OK, you can't have any more than 20,000, nobody would be...
we're not
hold on, but weren't we talking about China? And I do think that the story with China is a different one.
Sure, and we'll come back to the story with China in a moment. But just on this question of to try to bring it down to the level of the individual, where are you on this, Professor Winters?
Very much so, that we need to unlock the individual. I don't buy any of the nonsense about small is beautiful. Everything has got to be small scale. We've got to be sort of self-sufficient in small units. But we have to have a system. It's something we have in this country, more or less, where individuals have the ability to do things to make their lives better, and we organize it in such a way that, with the exception of most of the bankers, if they're making their lives better, they're not making anybody else's life worse. When it adds up to everybody getting better.
No, my kids are... Anyway, but hold on. But what I actually wanted to say was China. I mean, the developing world right now, you can sort of chop it up in those parts where the state is taking a leading role and those where it's not. And I definitely would not characterize China somehow sort of 80% being led by private initiative. They're spending $1.7 trillion equivalent in the next 5 years on new areas that most of the West is ignoring. New engines. I mean, we still drive cars today like we drove them more or less in the 1920s. An internal combustion engine is mad, and China is one of the only countries that is spending in that area. So new generation IT, new engines, environmentally friendly technologies. They are leading in the world in solar, wind, biofuels, hopefully not shale. But the point is that's part of its success. It's obviously not the only thing, in that it's very different from many other countries. They would not be growing today as they're growing without that vision from the state.
The Chinese government spends just about 1% of GDP on education. Now, the Chinese people have to chip in some more.
It's just increased by 170% the money it's spending on R&D. I mean, China today is not China 10 years ago.
basic education for 1.3 billion people. I mean, you were worried about inequality at the school gate of the primary schools. If you go to China, I think you will find every bit as much inequality.
Sure, but it's the trajectory that we need to look at. The trajectory in this country is very problematic. What's happening to education, what's happening to the way we even talk about the state. In China, I think the trajectory is
no, please wait for the microphone. Can we get a microphone to this gentleman as quickly as possible, because he's got something... No, do you know, it doesn't work because we need to pick it up for the thing. I don't even know if we can get to you. Forgive me. No, he hasn't asked a question. The gentleman at the back, has he? Let's get a microphone to this gentleman here in the green shirt. I hope it's on point, by the way, otherwise we're going to be in trouble. Oh, actually, one second.
I'll be super quick. No, I just wanted to say I'm pretty sure that I read a UNICEF report last week that puts UK above the whole of the rest of Europe.
Yeah, we've actually
inequality
improved
in education.
Yeah, okay.
UNICEF, yeah.
We've improved from where we were. We're still pretty rubbish. The gentleman in the green shirt.
Hi, my name is Sunny Bruta. I'm from Brighton. I have a particular question from Nicola. If you earn £20,000 a year, can you feed your 6 children, and can you have a diamond ring and diamond bracelet?
I think I'm slightly becoming the fool guy here and sort of getting blamed for all the worst aspects of capitalism. But I mean, if I had to,
I do not want to get sidetracked particularly. I know there's a lot of things that are covered, but can we try not to make it personal, please? The lady.
I'm Pauline Gorman from London now, an ex-Sussex graduate, and I certainly couldn't go along with Nicola Horlick's viewpoint, if only because I don't think I'll be alive in 30 years' time. And but I think I find, this is the cosy view of capitalism and how it might pan out okay for everybody. This doesn't seem to be related to the capitalism that is bombing hell out of Iraq, that for the purposes of getting oil and then using those revenues to then rebuild the country.
Lovely, thank you very much.
You're not going to give me any more time.
No, well,
you don't agree with my opinion.
no,
so
it's not that. It's not that. I tell you what I'm conscious
yes.
of. I'm conscious of that we have the capitalism, long live capitalism, and I just don't want to get sidetracked.
No, I'm saying that these people are talking about tinkering with a system that is essentially, it's wrong. You can't blame Nicolaholic. You can't blame capitalists. That's how it is. We have to change the system, as one of the questioners said there.
Apologies, I cut you off a little bit too early.
We have got to have a state ownership system, and we have got to have a democratic state ownership system.
Okay, let's get that microphone to the gentleman. Actually, yes, the lady there with the dark hair at the back. Yep, got your hand up.
Hello, I'm Hannah Conduct from London and a Sussex graduate. I wonder if anyone's brave enough to address the issue that China has addressed, and that is this not all about population control? Yeah? And I'm interested to hear what the panellists have to say about that.
Oh my goodness, we could do another hour on that.
2 women on that have 10 children.
Okay, is anybody, what I'm just asking, 644. I don't know about you. Can I have a very quick thought on this before we move on?
It's not all about population control, but population is very important. It's very important, for example, in fighting climate change. Increasing population is one of the biggest sources of the growth of carbon emissions. Less population, you'll reduce pressure there. So it is very important, sure.
Can I just say something about that? I think that China has a huge problem because it's not going to be able to pay for its old people. It's got what we've got, but actually amplified because of the one-child policy. And our country, I think, has benefited from immigration because our birth rate has actually gone up in the last few years. And so actually that's good for our economy. If you look at other economies in Europe, like Italy, the birth rate's gone down to 0.8. And they're going to have huge problems going forward because of that.
Yeah, there's a short-run, long-run trade-off here. In the short run, very clearly, managing population means you get what the Chinese have benefited from in the last 20 years, so-called demographic dividend, many more workers per dependent. In the long run, managing population is very difficult. You have to find a way of doing it such that it's balanced. It is very clear that population puts great strain on the planet. One of the principal ways of reducing population growth, get richer. That's what we observe very clearly.
I can see from my watch we're already sort of sailing right over our supposed end time. So I'm going to move on to the section. I'll try to come back to you and those who I've been hoping to go to. Look, the final section is really, in one sense, it's a wrap-up. It's where do we go from here? Clearly, it's not one extreme, it's the other. It's not Reagan or the Soviet Union. It's somewhere in the middle. And Professor Mariana Mazzucato, could you speak to that idea about how we could make capitalism more moral, fair, or responsible?
Yes, but in some ways I almost want to start from scratch, which is, what is capitalism? I think there's huge myths about it, which have actually been in some ways propagated here. And let me just define capitalism very specifically. And by the way, Marx and Engels always argued about this. They didn't agree of when capitalism actually began, but that's another story. Now, I think that we could define capitalism as, in theory, sort of a market-driven system, and one that is also driven by innovation. So, feudalism for 500 years, very little actually changed. But both these issues, markets and innovation, are hugely mythologized. Just some quick history here. A wonderful book, if you're interested in history, Karl Polanyi, The Great Transformation. I recommend it, because what he basically shows is that there's different types of markets. There's local markets, national markets, and international markets. And local, oh God, I didn't even see all. Local and international markets are actually much older than capitalism. They've been around since the ancient Egyptians. The capitalist market, so the national market, the notion that, this is a clinic lipstick, so it's not a good example, but the notion that there's an average price for a kilo of oranges, that's very recent. That is capitalism. That's the last 300 years, and there's nothing natural about that. It was imposed by the state. Okay, it's it's a wonderful book because it actually goes over, how exactly this happened. But just the fact that the national market, which is the capitalist market, is the least natural of these three. If anything, the local and the international one almost seem natural because they've been around forever. It was imposed by the state. So already there, one has to be careful because then the distinction between market and state, all of a sudden becomes really fuzzy. Now, coming to innovation, what's fascinating is there, it's even more fuzzy. So if you think of the big question in Europe for the last sort of 20 years has been, why is it that, Google, or the exact company that one has in question would change depending what year one was asking this, but anyway, Google, Facebook, Amazon, Apple, why are they all coming out of the US, out of Silicon Valley, not out of Europe? And the answer that's been given is that, well, capitalism, right? I mean, the US has a much more market-driven system. Maybe we have less inequality in Europe because we have this welfare state, but actually the reason that the US system, its innovation machine, has been more productive and produced these great, high-tech companies like Google and Apple, et cetera, is because it's been more market-driven. It couldn't be more wrong. It is exactly the opposite. If you look at Silicon Valley, just as an example, or take your iPhone, we've all been told to leave it on the other side, everything that makes the iPhone smart and not stupid is the state. So the internet, GPS, touchscreen display, all the communication technology, even this thing that I always press by accident on the iPhone 5, the Siri thing that you can even ask it if God exists, and every time it gives you a different answer, state funded. Now, that doesn't mean that someone like Steve Jobs wasn't important. There's not enough people like Steve Jobs. He was a genius, but what he did, which so many entrepreneurs have done, is he rode a massive wave of state investments, right? So there's this wonderful speech he gave to the Stanford graduating class in 2005, very inspirational, wonderful speech. However, it would have been more inspirational if he sort of ended with a different line. How he ended was, stay hungry, stay foolish. That's what drives innovation. Now, can you imagine what it would be to be foolish in a country or in a state, because in California lots of these investments happened, that hadn't made those investments? You would have simply been foolish. Yeah. Venture capital, and I'm sure Nicola would probably confirm this, has all over the world often ridden, in those cases where venture capital has been successful, there's plenty of not successful venture capital, ridden the waves of state investments. In biotechnology, the venture capitalists came 15 years after the state made the big investments. Take all the medicines today, okay, so without even talking about a long time ago, today, what's wonderful for people like me who do time series analysis, where we actually need lots of data over time, is you can take every single medicine that has come out over the last 10 years and divide it up on whether it's really innovative, so new molecular entities with priority rating, or these Me Too drugs, slight variations of existing drugs. And it turns out that 75% of the really radical, innovative drugs are coming out of public labs or public funding, NIH. The National Institutes of Health in the US, the market-driven economy, public money, has spent $600 billion over the last 10 years. Just in 2012, $32 billion on the biotech and pharmaceutical knowledge base. Then you have companies like Pfizer, who recently left Sandwich, Kent, and go to Boston. It's really quite ironic that then what they say they need in a country like this is they want lower tax, they want the R&D tax credits, they want the patent box, which we might talk about later how foolish it is as a policy. They want less regulation, less red tape, but then where they walk is not where you have less red tape, less tax. They're going to a country which spends $32 billion a year in 2012 on that knowledge base. Now, that's just to say that in innovation, which is one of the core driving forces of capitalism, because again, it wasn't there for 500 years before capitalism, the whole market versus state thing is also very much hyped up. Now, why this is so important today is we are currently, we've just experienced a massive financial crisis, which turned into an economic crisis and increasingly a sovereign debt crisis. And often people forget, what actually caused the crisis, which we mentioned before was private debt, not public debt. But there is, huge pressure today on public budgets. But just think of how we talk about it. So Greece, the famous pigs, Portugal, Ireland, Italy, Greece, and Spain, which are the periphery of Europe that have their budgets especially under attack, and there's all these different types of austerity programs. What Greece is being told to do is tighten its belt. Why? Because look at the successful parts of Europe. Look at Germany. Look what it did. It tightened its belt. It held down wages during the Schroeder years when productivity was riding. That's what Greece should do. The same thing's being told to Italy. Really? That's what Germany did? What did Germany do? Germany is one of the countries in Europe that spends the most on R&D. This is, by the way, why it also wins procurement contracts in this country, Siemens. It has the Fraunhofer Institutes publicly funded, which produce these science industry links. It has a state investment bank, which produces the type of finance that I was talking about before through the KfW, so patient, long-term committed finance. What would happen? I mean, just imagine how different the recipes would be to the pigs if we were saying, that's what you should do. It would be a radical change in mindset. But what that requires is a different understanding of what the state is. And there's another great book that I really recommend people read. It's one by Tony Judt called Ill Fares the Land. And what he says is, if you look at the attack on the welfare state, which more or less began with Thatcher and Reagan, it's been a discursive attack, he says. The words we've used to talk about the state have co-evolved with the attack on it. So he gives examples like the word administration. You know, all of a sudden it popped up in the 80s that we would talk about different departments in government as the, something's rather administration. I mean, how boring is that, right? The government administering. And so then you get, articles in The Economist talking about the Leviathan, the big government. If you look at actually what successful states have done, so I would say China today, Brazil today, Finland, Denmark today, Germany today, they've done much more than what economists even know how to talk about. Economists, the only real language we have when we talk about governments is governments fixing market failures. So it's sort of a nurse that comes in with different bandages. We don't talk about what Polanyi talked about in this great book that I mentioned at the beginning, which is governments have shaped and created markets. And if you look again at Silicon Valley, something like 75% of the R&D spending that was done in all the different sectors, nanotech, biotech, internet, were mission driven, which is much more than just sort of putting a bandage here and there. Whether it's putting a man on the moon or funding the internet from scratch, it required both the basic research, the applied research. It required actually funding the early stage of companies like Apple, Compaq, and Intel all got the early stage money, not from venture capital that really fears actually high risk, but from government. So the real question I'd have today are two. What are the missions that are going to drive us today? And how to kickstart government to really react to those missions? Is it around climate change? And if so, what do we do about it? And the second thing is, are we sure that our diagnosis, if you want, of what has both caused the crisis, but what we are telling the weakest parts of Europe and the world to do today aren't exactly the opposite of what they should be doing if you start looking around at what the successful countries did?
Let's get some response to this. We're not from the sounds of it, we're not in a capitalist system anyway. That's one interpretation.
No, we are in the capitalist system. The question in the sense that one has to ask is really the following. What's the proportion of our effort that we need to put into all of these innovative things? Do we think if we told the Greeks to spend 10% of GDP on innovation that we would get a great deal out of it? We might, but that's where we don't know. The point is that capitalism produces all sorts of things, not necessarily doing the innovation, but turning the innovations into things that are useful. And so drawing that line is the job that we've got to do.
Okay. Can you answer that question of what Greece should be told instead of, if they're being told the wrong thing and they're concentrating on the wrong?
First of all, this country's even worse off than Greece in many ways. We just have a central bank that can bail us out. I mean, that's one of the big problems in Greece right now, that it's caught up in the euro without a proper central bank that's going to come in. But anyway, just
to that narrow question of what Greece should be told.
It's definitely not just innovation. It's about education. It's about skills. It's about governance within the public sector. I mean, there's a self-fulfilling prophecy. In countries like, and let's start talking about this country, which is in a very bad state if you look at all the indicators, there's a self-fulfilling prophecy where the more you talk down the state, the less able you're even going to be able to bring in sort of the brightest minds. Of course, they're going to prefer to go to Goldman Sachs. If you look at DARPA, which again funded the internet, or BNDES today, they had very specific sort of organizational incentives. I mean, DARPA basically has this secondment where they brought in top-level scientists. And by the way, even today, the Department of Energy is run, up until recently, was run by a Nobel Prize-winning physicist. Right? So again, in this market system, actually, they've been able to attract some of the top minds within government. Here, where we talk down the state, we're not even able to attract within state institutions, and Greece is the worst example of this. So what we should be telling Greece is do more. not only spend more for the obvious Keynesian reasons that the government should be the opposite of a business, but reform your public sector, not cut it down.
Greece should leave the Eurozone.
I agree with that.
Say that again, please.
That Greece should leave the Eurozone. I completely agree with that. Yeah.
Okay.
I think, if I was a Greek, I'd feel appalled and upset by being forced to stay in the Eurozone. They need to devalue. That's what needs to happen if you're tied into the euro.
Okay, well, they're both saying they should leave the
Eurozone. They need to
Eurozone.
have their own currency, which is at a low rate against other currencies.
And in terms of the message, did you want to comment on what Professor Matsukuta
said?
Yes,
I'd like to ask, is there anything wrong with the state investing in and putting money into research? What's wrong with it? I don't see why that's wrong.
I don't think you're saying it's wrong, are you? You're just saying we're just not recognising it for what it is.
Yeah, but that's great, isn't it? If the state wants to invest in research, but you were sort of presenting it as almost being, a problem.
No. No. No, it's okay, because maybe I didn't say it properly.
No, don't say it again. Because we are so over time that I presume that most people got it, that you're quite happy that it's just a misrepresentation. Right, some questions from the floor, because we are, and I'm going to be brutal. They better be to the point. So, the gentleman in the pink shirt, you've been so patient. Let's get them, bear with us a few minutes longer.
Yes, hi there. Raul Penaranda from Sussex. I think we can all agree that capitalism is not going to die anytime soon. But I would contend that it needs to be a different capitalism, or at least a capitalism with new clothes. And also delighted that the so-called developing world came to the fore, in the sense that prior to, in the last 20 years or so, they were subservient. Now, actually, they do something. Probably most people are wearing Chinese goods. And whilst we were talking, actually, I picked up this very interesting figure that tells us, and to me shows why capitalism sucks, is the developing world now spends $13 billion, that's dollars, on debt repayment for every billion that they receive in grants. And I think that's criminal. So that's why capitalism should die.
Okay. Some more questions or points, preferably the gentleman here in the black jumper. There's a microphone coming from the side.
Right.
Go for it.
I just had a general question for the discussion. The question is, capitalism is dead, long live capitalism. And in the introduction it says, for most of the last century, the alternative to capitalism was socialism, but socialism in its classical form seems to have failed. Now, listening to the panel overall on socialism and so on, I can see that Professor Matsukato wants the state to run R&D, wants the states to do something about global warming. Lord Skidelsky wants the state to do the third way. Socialism 2.0 will have property rights, but we'll do everything else. Nicola thinks the NHS is centrally planning our health service is a great thing. And Professor Alan Winter seemed to be quite positive about the Chinese example. At no point have we mentioned public choice theory, which I find a bit upsetting. Governance and the way we govern is very important. We've not spoken at all about that. And I find it rather surprising. I thought the lesson of the 20th century was that we should do less central planning and that there was a knowledge problem. There's the socialist calculation debate, but it seems Hayek lost and Keynes won. So why isn't that being discussed?
Absolutely beautiful. Thank you very much. Not least because it's a perfect wrap of where we are to now and leads us nicely into a last question of each of our panellists, if I may, which if you could answer that question, you should be doing this job. If you could answer that question, it's in one sense it's quite a broad one, but about who wants to kick off? I'm looking at you, Nicola, because you haven't spoken in a while.
Is this a wrap-up?
This is a wrap-up. This is your last chance to say something about, Professor Winter, do you want to answer that, actually?
Yes,
Do you want to start off with that, answering this sort of...
Yes. Well, of course, public choice is very important. It goes back to, I think, the first question this gentleman posed about, it's about power. And that is very important. And that's one of the things that went wrong in the banking sector, that in a sense the bankers got themselves into a position where they could run stuff and interfere with stuff that actually they should not have been, that there should have been independent administration of. However, public choice is but one aspect of organising a society. And one needs institutions that keep public choice issues sort of fairly much under control. And I think the question of how economies are doing involves considerably more. So I certainly wouldn't want to advocate the political system that China has, and I hope I didn't do that. But on the other hand, the idea of turning markets loose is something that the Chinese really have taken to heart.
Okay, Professor Matsukato, just a final brief thought on this question of governance and public choice.
Well, there's an interesting statistic that, the Keynesian multiplier, right? So the degree to which total output increases for every level of, sort of government pound investment. It's 3 times as high. The multiplier is 3 times as high when that spending is directed towards something, not just random, yeah? So the big question is, who decides that direction, yeah? When it was directed towards the IT revolution, yeah? Today, should we direct it towards green? If so, who makes those decisions? And what I was trying to say before is there's the self-fulfilling prophecy. The more you think the state is unable, the more it sort of becomes wimpy in the background. I mean, if you go to BIS, the Business Innovation and Skills Department in this country, in the city, on #1 Victoria Street, there used to be, I actually told them to take it down, and they did take it down. There was a big sign that said, Britain is great, lowest tax, lowest regulation. If that's what you think is driving investment and the dynamism of the country, you're going to be in a huge problem. If you think that you also need, along with a dynamic private sector, a dynamic public sector, which co-decides how to determine that directionality, you can bet that you bring in to these public sector institutions some top minds.
Okay,
I don't really have much more to say, except that I do think we have a reasonably good balance between the public sector and the private sector in this country. And it's gone much more towards the private side as a result of privatisation and so on and so forth. But I think actually the balance works pretty well as it is.
Where we are now. And a final thought, Lord Skidelsky.
Yeah, well, I was very struck by the question in the middle, by a gentleman in the middle. He said, capitalism captures the secrets in our heads. I think that was one of the phrases you used. But okay. Now, I'm just going to say that I like that very much. And it means that individuals are shaped to a huge extent by society. And therefore, if you start just with individuals and their choices, or rather you end with just individuals and choices, you miss a huge amount of the plot of human behavior. We're not Robinson Crusoes. Point 1. Point 2, very shortly, how do you have a moral capitalism when you start talking about morals again?
And on that point, I'd like to thank all our panellists, Professor Mariana Mazzucato, Lord Skidelsky, Professor Alan Wilters, Nicola Horlick, and also thank you to all of you for being so patient. I'm sorry to those who I didn't get questions. Thank you all.